It was late September of 2023 when my closest friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods. We had planned it as a getaway from the stress of work, school, and the humdrum of daily life. A weekend of hiking, bonfires, and laughter sounded like the perfect escape. But what we found in those woods was something none of us were prepared for. There were 5 of us. Sarah, my best friend since middle school. James, her boyfriend. Mia, my adventurous cousin. Eric, the skeptic who always rolled his eyes at anything supernatural. And me. I had been the one to suggest the trip, having heard about the cabin from a coworker. She had described it as quaint and peaceful, a perfect retreat. But she had also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that locals avoided the area. When I asked why, she shrugged and said something about old stories. I had laughed it off at the time. The drive up was uneventful. The cabin was nestled in a dense forest, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through the towering pines. As we approached, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched across the gravel path. The cabin itself was charming at first glance, with its rustic wooden exterior and a small porch that overlooked a clearing. But as the car rolled to a stop, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "This place is perfect," Mia said, jumping out of the car and stretching. "It's definitely secluded," Sarah added, her voice tinged with unease as she glanced around the thick forest. "That's the point," James said, slinging an arm around her shoulders. "No distractions." Eric, as always, was less enthusiastic. "Looks like the kind of place where people get murdered in horror movies," he muttered. "Oh, come on," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just a cabin. Let's get unpacked." We spent the evening settling in. The interior was cozy, with a stone fireplace, mismatched furniture, and a faint smell of pine. We found an old journal on the coffee table, its leather cover cracked and worn. Mia picked it up immediately, flipping through its yellowed pages. "It's blank," she said, sounding disappointed. "Probably left by the last guests," I said, though something about it made me uneasy. After dinner, we gathered around the fire pit outside, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. The stars were brilliant, the kind of clarity you only see far away from city lights. It was peaceful, almost enough to make me forget the strange feeling that had lingered since we arrived. Almost. Around midnight, as the fire died down, we decided to call it a night. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, so we paired off Sarah and James in one, Mia and I in another, and Eric taking the smallest room. The night was still, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was a branch against the window, but as I listened, it became clear that it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I sat up, my heart pounding. Mia stirred beside me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her eyes wide. "What is it?" "I don't know." The tapping stopped, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just the house settling or an animal outside. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I mentioned the sound to the others. Eric rolled his eyes. "Probably just a raccoon or something," he said. "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. We spent the day hiking through the woods, following a narrow trail that wound past a crystal-clear stream and up to a rocky overlook. The view was breathtaking, and for a while, I forgot about the strange noise from the night before. We laughed, took photos, and even dared each other to wade into the icy water of the stream. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping low in the sky. That night, things got worse. We were gathered in the living room, playing cards and sharing a bottle of wine, when the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Mia laughed nervously. "Okay, that's creepy," she said. "I'll check the breaker," James said, grabbing a flashlight. He returned a few minutes later, shaking his head. "No luck. It's probably the wiring." "Great," Eric muttered. "Now what?" We decided to make the best of it, lighting a few candles we had found in the kitchen. The flickering light cast long shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel even more claustrophobic. It wasn't long before we heard it again, the tapping. It was louder this time, coming from the front door. Everyone froze, the tension in the room palpable. "Did anyone hear that?" Sarah whispered. It's probably just the wind, Eric said, though his voice lacked its usual sarcasm. The tapping came again, more insistent. Mia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Should we check? James asked, his voice low. Are you crazy? Sarah hissed. What if it's, I don't know, something dangerous? We can't just ignore it, James said, already moving toward the door. I grabbed his arm. Wait, let's all go together. Reluctantly, we followed him to the door. James held the flashlight, its beam shaky as he unlocked the door and swung it open. The porch was empty, the forest beyond shrouded in darkness. But as we stepped outside, the beam of the flashlight caught something on the ground. Footprints. They were fresh, leading from the edge of the woods to the porch. This doesn't make sense, Mia whispered. Whoever it was, they're gone now, James said, though his voice betrayed his unease. We went back inside, locking the door behind us. No one slept that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, set us on edge. By morning, we were exhausted, but determined to figure out what was going on. Eric suggested we explore the woods, thinking we might find some explanation for the footprints. I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but no one had a better plan. Armed with flashlights and a sense of trepidation, we ventured into the forest. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects conspicuously absent. As we followed the footprints, they led us to a clearing where the trees grew in a perfect circle. In the center stood an old, weathered structure, a small, crumbling shed that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. What the hell is this? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Let's check it out, James said, already moving toward the shed. Are you serious? Mia hissed. This is how people die in horror movies. We've come this far, Eric said, his usual skepticism replaced with curiosity. The door to the shed was ajar, creaking loudly as James pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, and the faint smell of decay made my stomach turn. The floor was covered in dirt, and strange symbols were carved into the walls. In the center of the room was a wooden box, its surface etched with the same symbols. Don't touch it, I said quickly. But James was already reaching for the lid. Inside the box was a collection of old, faded photographs. They were of people, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and pain. My stomach churned as I flipped through them, a growing sense of dread washing over me. We need to leave, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Now. As we turned to go, the door slammed shut with a force that made us all jump. The air seemed to grow colder, and a low, guttural sound filled the room. It was like nothing I'd ever heard, a mix of a growl and a whisper. What the hell is happening? Mia cried, her voice rising in panic. James and Eric threw their weight against the door, finally forcing it open. We ran back to the cabin, the sound following us, growing louder with each step. By the time we slammed the cabin door shut, we were all shaking. None of us wanted to admit it, but we knew we had disturbed something in those woods, something that wasn't meant to be found. We packed our things in silence, leaving the cabin as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods, but I do know one thing. Some places are better left alone.